everyone, I'm Kate and I'm part of the Latin Link team in Guatemala. To date, we have about 70 cases in Guatemala. 15 people have recovered, but 3 have died. 3 weeks ago, when there were only 6 cases in the country, the president of Guatemala took the decision to close all the airports, all the borders, all public transport, suspend all non-essential work, close down gatherings and events, and close down all shopping centres, restaurants, cinemas. Also, as of this week, Holy Week, travel outside your department or county has been completely banned. So basically there are only petrol stations, banks, pharmacies and supermarkets open, as well as, of course, all of the health services. And 2 weeks ago, also a 12-hour curfew was introduced. That means that between the hours of 4 p.m. and 4 a.m., if you are outside of your house, you will be arrested. In general, there's been a mixed response in the country. On the whole, people have recognised the need to put these really decisive measures in place so soon, because people recognise that the health system here just wouldn't be able to cope with just the number of cases that we're seeing in many other countries. However, some of these measures aren't as strict as they are in other Latin American countries. So, for example, people can still use private transport. There's actually even still quite a bit of traffic on the road sometimes, and long queues outside of supermarkets. The challenge really in Guatemala is that 60% of the population live below the poverty line and 23% in extreme poverty. Mainly those people are in rural areas, which makes just the living conditions where social isolation is required really challenging, with having many multiple families together and multiple family members in the same home. Making that social distancing really challenging. Also in the rural areas, there are lots of villages that are quite cut off, and so there's a real sense in those areas that coronavirus will never arrive. So lots of people actually aren't taking the preventative measures seriously, and so in the case that the virus would arrive in those villages, that could be absolutely devastating. Those who can find work have to continue working, even if it would be considered non-essential. Those people, especially those living below the poverty line, don't have an option not to work. So they're still going out and putting themselves at risk every day, because they are living day to day and have to work to survive. And of course, those who have lost their work due to coronavirus are even in a even more desperate situation. So it's really challenging here, particularly for the poorest families. The government has just announced that food parcels and some economic assistance for the poorest families will be available. So we really hope that will be enough and will meet the need. We have just heard that the first community case was announced just a day or two ago, which means that someone who was not knowingly in direct contact with a diagnosed person has contracted coronavirus. So we suspect that cases are going to soar in the weeks to come. I have 2 main roles here in Guatemala. I'm a social worker for Kids Alive's Oasis ministry, and I'm the team leader of the Latin Link Guatemala and Mexico team. Kids Alive's Oasis ministry is a children's home for girls who have been victims of sexual violence, but we also work with their families to promote family reunification and restoration of the family, and support legal services to promote justice in Guatemala. In order to limit the number of staff on site at Oasis, I've been asked to work from home. But of course, essential staff, caregiving staff have been working flat out. The girls, understandably, are pretty fed up, but they are safe, they are well, they have a timetable full of various different activities. They are, however, particularly at risk in this situation because they've all experienced trauma. And this is a great time of stress for everyone. And so they can be triggered to go back into what we often call our trauma brains. So actually this can be quite a dangerous reminder for them in these times. Unfortunately, sexual violence, particularly against women and children and girls, particularly at risk as well, is incredibly prolific in Guatemala. And actually in this situation now, when children and women are having to stay in their homes, that we're also going to see a massive surge in sexual violence towards women and children, which is really concerning. But in terms of my particular roles, actually the more urgent need at the moment has been to support the Latin Link team members in Guatemala and Mexico. So alongside Maddie, who's our short-term coordinator in Guatemala, and Myra and Jeff, who are with me on the leadership team, we've been helping members some of whom have needed to leave the country. This has been quite difficult because our borders have been closed the past 3 weeks, but there are a few diplomatic flights leaving, and the land border to Mexico is open. So we've been able to support a few members of our team to go back to Europe. We're also finding new ways to connect online, to support one another in these really challenging times, especially when it's challenging to be away from your passport culture, from family members and everything. So we are finding new ways to connect and be community, and especially when we're also feeling the loss of some of our team members as well. This is a really strange time, and to be honest, God has been teaching me that in a new way that it's okay to not be okay. Wherever we are in the world, at some point in the last month, I'm sure we've all probably felt frustrated or sad or anxious, bored, grieved, and kind of in a pit. But what the cross teaches us, particularly at this time of year, is that not only has Jesus experienced everything that we're feeling at the moment and more, but he jumps in that pit with us, and also that he knows the way out. So that at the moment has been a really encouraging message for me. And even in the anxiety and the sadness, there is hope and encouragement. We're learning to do community in a new way. It's been really great to be part of the virtual congregation of our sending church, Soul Survivor Watford, and be able to be as present in those services as the other church members, even from here in Guatemala. And we can see so much of God's goodness as well. The president of Guatemala, for example, has only been in office for a few months, and he's a medical doctor. That was no coincidence that he has been elected for this time. He's also called the country to days of national prayer and fasting. And also we've just heard recently that the Guatemalan government requires a weekly report from every registered children's home in the country. And to date, not a single child in care has presented symptoms of coronavirus. So we are so thankful for that. Well, we're just really thankful that there will be lots of people seeing this video, all who are willing and eager to be praying for mission partners all over the world. There are 3 things in particular we'd like to ask prayer for. Firstly, for physical, emotional and spiritual health for all of the members of the Latin Link team in Guatemala and Mexico. That God would comfort us when we're all feeling anxious, especially about family members far away. Also, we have members who are frustrated that they can't leave the country, or that if they do, then there's no guarantee when they would be able to return. Also, that God would take away any sense of guilt when just doing the best we can doesn't look very productive, or much less productive than normal. And for faith in provision as well, knowing that financial support may decrease as the economic situation impacts donors all over the world. Secondly, I would really love to pray for the President of Guatemala and other leaders in Guatemala, particularly in child protection and justice, and as I mentioned earlier, for protection for women and girls in risky situations in this time. But particularly for the leaders of this nation, for their health, physical strength just to keep going, wisdom to make difficult decisions, and that they may be honest and humble and seek Jesus in all they do. And last but not least, let's pray for the global Church of Christ, that we may be able to show the world that although there is suffering at this time, there is also hope and healing, and that although there is darkness, there is also light. So thanks very much for joining with us in those prayers.